Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. Where are you watching? Let us know in the comments. Today, we're going to go on a trip to the dark mountains of Missouri in 1882. Take a moment to picture the Ozarks' thick forests in the fall of that year. The golden leaves fell quietly along paths that sound like they could whisper old secrets. In this mountainous part of southwestern Missouri, where October winds are so cold they feel like they can cut right through you. Small, rural towns were cut off from each other by sharp blades and were only linked by dirt roads that wound between deep valleys and hills covered with oak trees that were hundreds of years old. Back then, Webster County was an area where civilization was still trying to make itself known. The railway had just recently arrived, making people in the area feel a mix of hope and mistrust. People who came to the Ozarks looking for cheap land and a new start quickly learned that the area had more to offer. Beautiful landscapes. In those mountain shadows, there was something that looked like it was watching every move, every breath, and every secret that was whispered in the wind. This is what Elizabeth Fairmont saw when she got to the small town of Marshfield in the second week of October. A 27-year-old woman with carefully combed brown hair and eyes that showed a level of determination that was unusual for the time. Elizabeth Fairmont was not like other pioneers. When she came back from Boston, she brought not only two clean leather, not only suitcases, but she also had a very important reason she kept secret. Years later, records from the Ozarkan Hotel found in county archives show that she registered under the name Elizabeth F. Fairmont and gave her job as a teacher. But something about her poise, the way she avoided long conversations, and the way she looked around the small town made it seem like she wasn't really there to teach kids. The hotel has. The owner, a man named Thomas Whitaker, later said that Elizabeth Fairmont was a lady with fine manners who could not hide a sense of urgency. It was unusual for the area that she paid for a week's stay with gold coins. Most of the people who came paid with cash or, more often, goods trade. Elizabeth Fairmont stuck to a strict schedule for the first 3 days. He would get up early, have a simple coffee in the hotel dining room, and then walk for a long time along the trails that went up and down the hills. People in the area started to notice her because she always had a small leather notebook with her and was writing in it all the time. When asked about her notes, she said that she was taking pictures of the plants in the area for a botanical study. Of course, Elizabeth Fairmont wasn't the only one in Marshfield. 3 men, not like most people who visit the Ozarks, had come to the city 2 days before her and were staying at a boarding house across the main street. They dressed like people from the city and had. The people had hands that were too soft to be farmers or lumberjacks, and their accents didn't sound like they were from Missouri. Abraham Hayes, the local sheriff and a veteran of the Civil War, had noticed that the arrivals happened at the same time. Over 100 years later, Hayes's personal notes were found in a forgotten box in the basement of City Hall. In them, he wrote, "There is something strange going on in our city." The woman from Boston asks too many questions about the old, abandoned lead mines, and the 3 people from outside the city seem to be waiting for something. The lead. Since the time of the colonies, the Ozarks mines have been used, leaving behind a maze of tunnels and chambers that go for miles below the surface. After the war, when lead prices dropped, many of these mines were closed down because the miners left to find work in the big cities. What was left was a maze of dark passages that not many people were brave enough to explore. Elizabeth Fairmont, on the other hand, seemed very interested in these empty buildings. On her walks, she was often seen near the locked doors of. She went through the old mines with her notebook in hand, writing down things that no one else could understand. The 3 mysterious men had been seen following the same paths, always keeping a safe distance and always keeping an eye on Elizabeth Fairmont. Something changed in the air in Little Marshfield on Thursday, October 17th. Like always, Elizabeth Fairmont didn't come down for breakfast. Thomas Whitaker went upstairs because he was worried that his most punctual guest wasn't there. To her room, around 9 a.m., the door was opened. She had just come back from a morning walk because the room was so clean. Even though her bags were where they belonged and her clothes were neatly folded in the closet, Elizabeth Fairmont was nowhere to be found. The disappearance of Elizabeth Fairmont made Marshfield feel tense, like the mist that rises in the Ozark valleys in the morning. With a long stare, Thomas Whitaker stood on the doorway for a long time, holding her room key. He seemed to be waiting for her to come out from behind the curtains. A perfectly reasonable reason for her absence, but there was no way to make sense of what he saw in the room. All of Elizabeth Fairmont's clothes were there, folded up nicely. Her jewelry, like the pearl necklace she wore every day, stayed on the vanity table. It looked like she was ready for a normal night's sleep because even her hiking boots were lined up at the foot of the bed. Whitaker was most worried about the fact that there were no signs of struggle or hurry. Everything was where it should have been except for Elizabeth Fairmont. The only thing, the small leather notebook she always carried, was gone. That was the same notebook where he wrote down his thoughts on the plants in the area. Whitaker had seen Elizabeth Fairmont writing on it while they were having dinner the night before. Her hands were moving quickly over the yellowed pages, and she kept her eyes on her the whole time in the hotel dining room. Right away, Sheriff Abraham Hayes was called. A man who was 52 years old, had gray hair and a scar on his left forehead from the Battle of Wilson Creek. Hayes had seen too much during the war to be easily scared, but he later wrote in his diaries that Elizabeth Fairmont's room made him feel strangely uneasy. Hayes said in his head, "There's something wrong here," as he carefully looked around the room. A woman doesn't just disappear and leave her most valuable things behind, especially not one like her, who seemed to plan her every move. The searches began early in the morning. Hayes put together groups of people from the area to search the paths Elizabeth Fairmont used to take. Men knew every rock, every tree that could cut you, and every dangerous turn in the steep paths like the back of their hands. They would quickly find Elizabeth Fairmont if she had been in an accident or gotten lost, but hours went by, and she was still nowhere to be found. There were no new footprints in the mud, no fabric pieces stuck in low branches, and no other signs that she had left the hotel in the morning. It looked like it had just went away in the thin mountain air. In the course of the search, Hayes found something that would completely change the investigation. The three strange men who showed up 2 days before Elizabeth Fairmont also didn't show up. When they didn't come back the night before, the pension where they were staying said so. Both of her rooms were clean, and all of her things were in the right places. Hayes wrote in his diary that night, "This is not a mishap. 4 people don't go away. At the same time from a small town without leaving any traces. This is about more than meets the eye, something that our small town might not be ready for." A widow named Mary Patterson, who lived in the house closest to the old lead mines, told the sheriff some disturbing things that changed the course of the investigation. In the early hours of Thursday morning, Mary woke up to the sound of whispering voices coming from the direction of the abandoned mines. The voices seemed to be coming from beneath the ground. Mary said in a shaking voice, "I couldn't understand what they were saying." But there were 4 or 5 people downstairs talking. I considered waking up my neighbor, but the noise stopped before I could decide. I feel bad that I didn't do anything. Hayes chose to check out the entrances to the old mines himself. What he found there really scared him. One of the doors that had been blocked off with wooden planks years ago was now only partly closed. With care, the planks were taken off and stacked next to the opening, as if someone planned to come back and put them back. Another scary thing Hayes found was close to the mine's entrance: fresh marks in the wet ground. There are the distinctive marks of light women's shoes and the heavy boot footprints of men. shoes that looked like they belonged to a teacher in Boston named Elizabeth Fairmont. The sheriff knew it would be dangerous to go down into that mine by himself. The old ones. People knew that excavations had deep pits, toxic gases that built up, and buildings that were unstable and could fall down at any time. But it was clear that the footprints were going away from the mountain and into the tunnels below, where it was very dark. That night, Hayes set up a search party to look into the mines. The next day, 5 brave men volunteered. One of them was James Morrison, a former miner who knew the Ozarks underground mazes better than anyone else. Morrison had been working in these mines for 15 years, before they were left behind. And if anyone knew how to safely get through the dark passages, it was him. Morrison told the people at the police station, "These mines go deeper than most people realize. Tunnels that go on for miles, natural rooms big enough for a church, and shafts that don't seem to have a bottom are all to be found. We'll need a lot of luck to find these people alive if they went in there." As work on getting ready for the underground expedition continued, Hayes, a visitor they didn't expect. A telegraph operator from Springfield came to Marshfield with an important message for the sheriff. The message was sent from Boston, Massachusetts, and it contained information that would completely change Hayes's view of Elizabeth Fairmont. The message was short, but it meant terrible things. In fact, Elizabeth Fairmont is not a teacher. A family in Boston hired this private investigator to look into what happened to their brother, Charles Fairmont. Happened in the Ozarks of Missouri last September. Please be very careful. There may be organized crime involved in this case. Police Chief Hayes's hands were shaking, and the Boston telegram fell out of his grasp like a dry leaf in the Ozarks' fall wind. Elizabeth Fairmont wasn't just a simple teacher who liked plants in the area. Following in the footsteps of her brother, who had gone missing just a month before, she was an experienced investigator. All of a sudden, his persistent questions about the abandoned mines, his long walks by himself, and that strange. The word notebook meant something completely different. In September, Charles Fairmont was last seen. According to the cable, this meant that Elizabeth Fairmont knew when she got to the Ozarks that something bad could have happened to him there. She wasn't keeping track of Flora. I was writing down evidence. Each note in her leather notebook probably had clues she had gathered about where Charles was, but she was gone, and so was the information. Hayes called. The men who would be going on the mine expedition had to meet quickly. The flashlights at the police station made it hard to read the telegram out loud, but he could see surprise and worry on the faces of people who had worked hard in the mountains for years. "It changes everything," the ex-miner, James Morrison, said. "If there is a criminal organization operating in our mountains, these mines could be much more dangerous than we imagined. We may be heading straight for an ambush because the tunnels are unstable and there are toxic gases around. But Hayes knew they had no choice. Down there in the depths of the ancient digs were Elizabeth Fairmont and the 3 strange men. Every hour that went by made it less likely that they would make it, if they were still alive. In that underground maze, if they were already dead, there would be no record of what really happened to them. The rescue team went down for the first time on the morning of October 19th, 2018, on Ozarks mines that have been closed down. There are 6 men with weapons, flashlights, ropes, digging tools, and flashlights. It was heavy and humid down below, and the air smelled like old mines because it was full of metal. In the narrow passageways, their voices echoed in a strange way, making a chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Through decades of work underground, Morrison had built up a mental map that he used to lead the group through the main tunnels. The footprints Hayes found at the entrance turned into. Less easy to follow as they moved through the rocky passages. And there were other signs that it had been a while. The walls had melted candle marks and small pieces of fabric stuck in the rocks. There was also something that made Hayes's blood run cold. There are dark marks on the floor that might be dried blood. In a whisper, Morrison pointed to a split in the path that led to even deeper levels of the mine. By following these marks, we can get to the old chambers, where we used to get the best lead veins. Also, those are the most dangerous spots. Some of these tunnels haven't been strengthened enough. The men heard something that stopped them in their tracks as they went deeper into the mountain. It was a steady, low sound, like someone whispering in the dark. Voices could be heard through the rocky passages, but the tunnel's strange sound effects made it impossible to tell the difference between words or even count how many people were talking. The Hayes told everyone to. "Don't say anything at all." Slowly, the group moved toward the sounds while partially covering the lanterns to make them less bright. The tunnel got wider over time until it opened up into a beautiful, natural room with a high ceiling that was hard to see in the dark and walls made of rock formations that seemed to glow in the lantern light. Because it was in this room that they found the first macabre of the expedition. The bones of a there were in the middle of the space. Recent campfire. Things that belonged to people were strewn around the campfire like they had been quickly left behind. A leather wallet for men, a pocket watch that had stopped at 3:45, and something that made Hayes' heart beat fast. When Elizabeth Fairmont opened her small leather notebook, she saw a page full of her neat handwriting. In a low voice, Morrison carefully opened the notebook and read Elizabeth Fairmont's last notes. "I found proof that Charles was right. The operation is a lot bigger than we thought. The mines are where something that came by train last week is being stored. Heavy boxes are kept in the rooms that are the deepest. There is more to the 3 men from Chicago than just watching. They are a part of the group. The last note in the notebook was dated Thursday, October 17th, and was likely written right before Elizabeth Fairmont disappeared. They understand I'm here. I learned too much. Check out the Stone Eagle's room if something bad happens to me. Charles." They took him without leaving a message. Hayes looked at Morrison with more and more urgency. "Do you understand where this room of the Stone Eagle is?" The former miner gave a serious nod. "I understand. There are at least 500 meters of depth below where we are now in this part of the mine. We will have to go through tunnels that were partly flooded last spring, though, in order to get there. Even for people who know these passages inside and out, it is a dangerous path." As Hayes thought about this, one of the expedition men made an even more discouraging news. Close to the chamber's other wall, there were marks on the rocky ground that looked like they were made by pulling something heavy. There were signs that pointed to a side tunnel that went down steeply into the mine's darkest depths. And there were small dark drops that had dried on the stone next to the drag marks. They both didn't want to fully imagine the story that the blood told them. The rock's dried blood marks told a scary story in silence. Hayes very carefully. He looked at every drop and dark spot on the chamber floor that looked like the withered petals of a scary flower. Based on the way the stains were arranged, it looked like someone had been hurt there, but not seriously. There was enough blood to show that someone had been hurt, but not enough to mean that someone was dead right away. Morrison showed the side tunnel where the drag marks went away because it was dark there. Miners in the past called that pass the Devil's Descent because it led down a steep tunnel into the mountains. Dangerous depths. In the years that the mine was open, 3 workers had died in that section because of collapses and poisonous gases that built up in the lower chambers. The expedition had to make a tough choice. If you kept following the drag marks, you would end up underground, where your chances of survival dropped dramatically with every meter you went down. Going back to the surface without any answers, on the other hand, would mean giving up on Elizabeth Fairmont and any chance of finding out what had gone wrong. What happened to Charles Fairmont a month before? The group went down the steep slope with Hayes in charge. Along with their progress, the air got thinner and more wet. They felt like the mountain was trying to push them out of their bowels because the walls of the tunnel were pressing against them. The sound of their heavy breathing echoed and mixed with the steady drip of water coming through the cracks in the rock, making it sound unsettling. They carefully went down for 40 minutes until they reached a part of the mine that Morrison had already been to. Not fully understand. There were clear signs of recent excavation work in the passages which had been artificially made longer. Someone wasn't mining for lead in these deep chambers. They were being used for other things. This deep well is where they found the first real proof of the operation that Elizabeth Fairmont had found. A side room had a neat stack of wooden boxes, each with a strange symbol on it that neither man could figure out. The boxes were too heavy to move. A single person, which confirmed the idea that a well-organized group was working in those depths. Hayes smashed open one of the smaller boxes and found something that changed the way he thought about the case completely. Inside, neatly wrapped in waxed cloth, were papers, maps, and photos that did not look like they belonged to a real mining operation. There were detailed maps of rail routes, schedules for freight trains, and lists of the valuable goods that came through the Ozarks in the fall. Even more disturbing were the pictures of armed men strategically placed along the rail lines, with handwritten notes pointing out weak spots where a train could stop and be robbed most easily. Elizabeth Fairmont had found more than just a normal place for criminals to hide. The abandoned mines were used as a secret base by a group of train thieves who used it as a place to plan their crimes. Hayes found something in the papers that helped him understand the real level of danger Elizabeth Fairmont was in. A full list of all the people who have asked about strange things going on in the area in the last few months. At the top of the list, next to Charles Fairmont's name, there was a scary note that just said, "Solved." Right below it, in fresher ink, was the name Elizabeth Fairmont, then the date, October 17th, and the word "captured." The discovery made Hayes's worst fears come true. Liz Fairmont was still alive when she was taken to deep in the mine, but her situation was very bad. The criminal group that worked in the underground chambers had already killed her brother Charles, and now she was an unwelcome witness because she knew too much about how they did business. In a room next door, Morrison found something just as scary. Proof that the room had been used as a temporary prison. It looked like someone had killed someone because there were chains on the rock walls, food scraps all over the floor, and even bloodstains on the stones. It was a common place for violent interrogations to happen. The drag marks that started in the upper chamber continued through the lower passages and led to even deeper tunnels that split off in different directions like veins in a huge body below the ground. There was a choice on each path that could mean the difference between finding Elizabeth Fairmont alive or finding more proof that she had died. While the group was pausing to decide which way to go, they heard a sound in the tunnels that seemed to come from far away. There was the clear sound of metal hitting stone, like someone was using tools or weapons deep inside the mine. The sound came from deep underground, where they were. It was in the most dangerous parts of the complex, where former miners rarely went during the years it was in use. Hayes looked at his watch. They had been underground for 4 hours, and the flashlights were showing signs that the batteries were dying. They had enough fuel for about 2 more hours of exploration before having to come back to the surface in the dark. The danger to their own lives and the chance that Elizabeth Fairmont would still be alive when they found her went up with every minute they spent in the depths. The metal sound echoed through the narrower passageways again, but this time it came from a certain direction that led to tunnels that Morrison vaguely remembered from his time working in the mine. Tunnels that lead to the stone chamber, the eagle that Elizabeth Fairmont wrote about in her last notes. The room where Charles Fairmont is said to have left a message before being captured by his enemies. There were parts of the path to the Stone Eagle's chamber that looked like they had been forgotten over time. The tunnels Morrison led them through were so narrow that they had to walk in a single file. The lanterns cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, which moved like restless spirits. With each step, the air got heavier because it was full of moisture from groundwater that had seeped into the lower parts of the mine over many years of not being used. The metallic sound they had heard earlier didn't come back. All they could hear was the sound of their own footsteps and the steady drip of water that made dark puddles along the path. Hayes started to wonder if they had really heard people, or if it was just the mountain adjusting, making noises that their worried minds took to be signs of life. After getting lost in the underground mazes for 2 hours, they finally made it to the end. Got to the Stone Eagle's room. The name fit perfectly when his flashlights lit up a natural rock formation on the ceiling of the cave that looked a lot like the shape of an eagle's wings spread out. The chamber was bigger than any other room they had been in before. It had many passages that led off in different directions, like the fingers of a huge hand buried in the rock. Morrison pointed to a spot on the wall where there were clear new signs of activity. A small hole had been dug in the rock with tools, making it a natural place to hide. Hayes carefully walked up and found a message from Charles Fairmont, which was what Elizabeth Fairmont had hoped to find. The message was cut into the stone with the point of a knife or something similar. The lettering was all over the place, like it was done by someone working in the dark or under a lot of stress. Charles had written on September 23rd. The main deposit was found by me. Snake Tunnel, 400 steps to the east. They understand I'm here. Find the names on the papers in case something goes wrong. Boston does need to know. There was something even scarier below the main message. Another message. This one has different handwriting that looks like it was written more recently. If you find this, Elizabeth, don't go down any further. They have me. Get away while you still can. CF. It was proven that Charles Fairmont had lived long enough after being captured to try to warn his sister. But the fact that there was a second message also meant that Elizabeth Fairmont had made it to that room before she was caught. She followed the hints her brother had left and found his message of warning. She kept looking into it until she was caught by the same group that had killed Charles. Hayes looked at the area around the message very carefully and found proof that what he thought was true. Footprints of women in the wet dirt on the floor, and small pieces of blue fabric that looked like the dress Elizabeth Fairmont wore on her last day as a servant. Seen at the hotel, along with something scarier. Fresh blood drops that hadn't dried all the way. In Charles's message, he talked about a serpent tunnel in a part of the mine that Morrison only knew about from hearing about it. It was a natural path that wound its way through the solid rock by following underground water veins that had been running through the mountain for thousands of years. The tunnel was notorious for having unstable structures and toxic gases that would sometimes build up in its lower levels. Using careful counting to go eastward, the expedition followed the clues that Charles left behind. It was even more dangerous than Morrison thought the snake's tunnel would be. Because the walls were not level and were slippery, the men had to lean on each other all the time to keep from slipping and falling into deep cracks in the rock floor. After 400 steps, they came to a road split where the tunnel split into 3 different paths. Hayes stopped to look at the ground for clues about which way to go when one of the men on the expedition found something very important. The body of a man wearing clothes that did not belong to a local miner was leaning against the rock wall and was partly hidden by a natural ledge. Even though the body had already started to break down, it was still possible to tell that the person had died about a month before. The man who was killed was dressed in high-quality clothes that an educated Bostonian might wear, while traveling west. What was even scarier was that they found IDs in the coat pockets, which proved their worst fears. The man named Charles Fairmont was found. It wasn't clear right away what caused the death, but there were clear signs of violence. There were tears in a few of the clothes. There were dark marks that might have been dried blood, and the way the body was positioned made it look like he had been dragged there and left there. Even scarier was the fact that the pockets had been searched, and everything valuable had been taken away. Charles had hidden something before he died, but Hayes found it. On the inside of his coat, there was a small folded piece of paper with names and phone numbers that clearly belonged to the criminal group that worked in the mines. The list had the names of people from faraway cities like Chicago and St. Louis, as well as monetary values that pointed to important financial transactions and dates that matched up with train robberies that had happened in the area over the past few months. The last thing on Charles's list was the most shocking of all. The date in the future is October 25th, just 6 days after his body was found. This entry pointed to a specific target, the Missouri Pacific freight train that would bring gold from the mines in Colorado to St. Louis through the Ozarks. The criminal group had not only killed Charles and captured Elizabeth Fairmont, but they were also getting ready to pull off their biggest theft yet, using the information they got from torturing people to get it. It's not just that Elizabeth Fairmont was a bothersome investigator. Criminals might have been able to use what she knew about her family's business in Boston to plan future attacks. When the body of Charles Fairmont was found, the expedition went from being very important to being much darker. Hayes knew that Elizabeth Fairmont was about to see the same thing happen to her as her brother. But there was one important difference. She had information that thieves thought was too valuable to waste right away. This meant that she might still be alive and being held captive deep in the mine. Morrison looked at all 3 of the paths that opened up at the fork. Each tunnel went into complete darkness, leaving no hints as to which way might lead to the main hideout of the criminal group. But there was one thing that made him pay attention. One of the passages looked like it had a lot more traffic than the people. The floor was packed down more. Heavy loads had been dragged along the walls by ropes, and the air smelled like a mix of tobacco smoke and human sweat. The expedition followed this path for almost an hour, slowly going down through tunnels that had clearly been changed so that people and things could move through them regularly. They found signs that the route was used a lot of the time at several places. There are small supply depots hidden in natural ahus and cracks in the walls where burned candles used to be, and even a spot where someone had used stolen wooden planks to build a crude bridge over a deep well. In this very deep part of the mine, Hayes found something that helped him understand how big the crime operation really was. A natural chamber had been turned into a complex underground system with different areas for different activities. There was a part that looked like it had been used as an armory, because the boxes of ammunition and guns were stacked against the rock walls. A had been built in another area. Planning site with maps hanging from the ceiling and makeshift tables with papers all over the place. What was even scarier was a part that had been turned into a makeshift jail. The walls had chains and handcuffs on them. There were dark stains on the floor that looked like they were from beatings, and food scraps that were all over the place showed that prisoners had been held there for a long time. It smelled awful, like fear, violence, and human despair had mixed together and taken over the place. The rock itself. Hayes looked very carefully around the prison area for clues that Elizabeth Fairmont had been held there. She looked through the trash on the floor and found a mother-of-pearl button that matched the buttons on the dress she was wearing when she disappeared. Strands of brown hair that were tied into one of the chains were next to the bud. This hair had the same color and texture that witnesses had said Elizabeth Fairmont had, but there was no one in the prison area. Anything that had happened to Lizzie Fairmont. She wasn't being held in that part of the mine anymore. Hayes began to worry that she had met the same end as Charles. There was one thing, though, that didn't quite fit with this theory. Why take the body out of that area if she was already dead? Charles was left where he was killed and then forgotten. By the time he died, he was no longer useful. In the planning area, Morrison found something on one of the maps that might have led to an answer. That package had a detailed plan for the attack on the cargo train is set for October 25th. The plan included not only the reason for the attack and where the attackers were, but also ways to deal with witnesses and a specific section on how to use the Boston prisoner to find out about East Coast routes that move valuables. Elizabeth Fairmont was not killed right away because the criminals found out that she knew a lot about money-related activities in places other than the Ozarks. His family in Boston took part in businesses that were involved in transporting valuables, trade routes, and shipping schedules that the criminal group could use in future operations. Based on the paperwork that was found, the group was a lot more complex than a simple gang of train thieves. They talked to criminals in many cities, planned raids in many states, and built a network of informants that let them predict with amazing accuracy when valuable cargo would be moving. They had intercepted letters, copied telegrams, and even reports from people in Boston who had been paid to keep an eye on the Fairmont family's activities. This showed that they knew about the investigation into the Fairmont brothers long before Charles got to the Ozarks. Charles was allowed to come to Missouri by the group because they wanted to know what he knew and who else was involved in the investigation. Hayes found an especially telling letter that had been written only 2 days before. The letter was sent to someone in Chicago and explained how the valuable items would be moved to a safer place before they were stolen. The letter clearly mentioned Elizabeth Fairmont and said that she would be moved to a different hiding place so that she could be questioned more thoroughly about information she had about how money works in the East. The place talked about in the letter was called the Underground Cathedral, which Morrison knew right away. It was a natural room. Ancient miners knew it for its huge size and rock formations that looked like the columns of a Gothic cathedral. It was in the deepest parts of the mine. It would take at least another hour to walk to the site through very dangerous tunnels. It was, however, the perfect place to hide for a group that needed to keep prisoners from being rescued. The expedition had to make its most important choice yet. Their lanterns were almost out of fuel. They had been down there for over 6 hours, and going into parts of the mine that not even Morrison was sure were stable wasn't safe for them. However, Elizabeth Fairmont was still alive. The longer she was locked up in the underground cathedral, the more likely it became that she would be killed as soon as her captors got all the useful information she had from her. Hayes decided that the process should go on. They had learned too much and traveled too far to leave Elizabeth Fairmont with the criminals who had already killed Charles. The trip to the underground cathedral led the group through the most dangerous tunnels they had ever seen. Morrison led the group through passages where parts of the roof had fallen in, making rocky obstacles that had to be carefully avoided. With each step, the air got thinner and more full of gases that made the men cough and get dizzy, which meant they had to stop often to get their balance back. At first, one lantern at a time, the flames died out, leaving only a few dim points of light. That they were only bright enough to see a few feet ahead. Hayes gave the last of the lanterns fuel because he knew they would only have about 40 minutes of light left before they had to sail into the total darkness of the underground depths. During one of these forced breaks, they heard the sound that had caught their attention the first time. Voices of people can be heard echoing through the rocky passageways. This time, the voices are clearly coming from the underground cathedral. These voices, though, were not the same as the ones before. Their hurried, authoritative tone made it sound like something important was going on in the main hideout of the criminal group. When they started to notice changes in the sound of the tunnels, Morrison knew they were getting close to the cathedral. The sounds of their footsteps got louder, which meant they were getting closer to a much bigger area. The air also changed. It got cooler and had a different kind of humidity that made it seem like groundwater was moving. Finally, after another 30 minutes of careful walking, they found a doorway that led to the cathedral below. The show that started in front of his dim lanterns was both amazing and scary at the same time. The natural room was very big, and the ceiling went down into the darkness above their heads. There were rock formations that looked exactly like the columns of an old Gothic cathedral. The cathedral wasn't empty, though. In the middle of the room, where several fires cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, there was a crime ring in full swing. At least 12 men moved through space, putting together supplies, checking weapons, and organizing gear for what looked like it was going to be a very important trip. Hayes finally saw Elizabeth Fairmont while she was tied to one of the natural columns. It was clear from afar, and in the uneven light of the fires, that she had been abused while she was being held captive. His clothes were torn and his hair was messy. His posture showed that he was both physically and emotionally worn out, but she was still alive, and more importantly, she seemed to be aware of what was going on around her. It was both good and bad for the rescue team to be where they were. They were in a natural gallery with a good view of the cathedral, but if anyone found them, they would be completely exposed, since there was only one way in and out of the gallery where they were. If the thieves found out about them, they would be trapped. Hayes. He paid close attention to what was going on below and started to understand what he was seeing. The thieves were getting ready to leave the cathedral, most likely to carry out the October 25th train robbery plan. Ammunition boxes were being loaded. Horses were being tacked up in a part of the chamber that Hayes hadn't seen at first, and maps were being passed around to the men. Also, Elizabeth Fairmont was getting ready to be moved. 2 of the criminals came up to her with more ropes. It's clear that they have plans to take her somewhere else. Hayes knew that this might be the only chance he had to try to save the people. Once Elizabeth Fairmont was taken out of the cathedral, it would be very hard to find her again in the mine's underground maze. The rescue mission faced terrible odds. 6 men with hunting guns fought 12 experienced criminals who were armed with rifles and pistols made for service. Their only advantage would be being able to surprise them, and even then, only if they were able to. Plan an attack that would kill several of the criminals at the same time. Morrison pointed to a certain part of the cathedral where a number of ammunition boxes were stacked next to one of the main fires. If they could set off an explosion in that area, it would make things more difficult for Elizabeth Fairmont to find. But for the plan to work, someone would have to go down into the cathedral and get very close to the weapons, which would put their own life and the lives of others at risk, letting the chamber fall apart, which could kill everyone inside. Hayes thought he didn't have many choices, but something happened that made things completely different. Elizabeth Fairmont, who had been watching and seemed to have done nothing, suddenly moved in a way that made it look like she was acting weaker than she really was. She got some of the ropes that were holding her to the rock formation to loosen up. The criminals didn't see Elizabeth Fairmont's attempt to escape right away. They paid too much attention to. They were getting ready to rob them, but Hayes knew it would only be minutes before someone noticed she was getting away. She could try to get away if she was able to get free completely. But where? There were many ways out of the cathedral, but most of them led to tunnels she didn't know about. It would be easy for her to get lost in the mountain. Hayes made a choice that changed how things turned out. Instead of trying to attack directly, which would have been impossible, he chose to spread a distraction that would let Elizabeth Fairmont get away and let her know that the rescue team is nearby at the same time. It was a dangerous plan that could kill everyone, but it was the only one that had a chance of working. The deputy sheriff told his men what they needed to do. Each person would pick a different criminal to go after. As soon as Hayes gave the order, everyone would shoot at the same time, making things as confusing as possible. Morrison. Hayes would try to get in touch with Elizabeth Fairmont during the chaos that would follow her job of setting off the bomb in the ammunition area. She was finally able to get free from the ropes that were holding her down, which was the attack moment. She moved quickly, which surprised both the people she was holding captive and the rescue team. To keep herself safe, she quickly rolled behind one of the bigger rocks. The criminals saw them get away almost right away, and alarm calls could be heard throughout the E. Sounds like the roars of angry animals coming from an underground cathedral. Hayes sent the message. From the gallery where the expedition was stationed, 6 rifles fired at the same time. Because of the way the rocks are shaped, the sound of gunfire echoed through the natural chamber so loudly that it was unbearable. 3 of the criminals fell right away when they were hit by the projectiles that could be seen through the smoke from the bonfires. The chaos that followed happened right away and for good. The rest of the criminals fanned. Some went for cover, firing back at the gallery, while others tried to find Elizabeth Fairmont in her new position. Morrison took advantage of the chaos to quickly get down to the cathedral level. He moved through the shadows like a ghost, knowing every bump in the rock. During the shooting, Elizabeth Fairmont showed a remarkable ability to stay calm. Instead of trying to get away right away, she stayed behind the rock formation to stay safe and started to carefully watch how the criminals. During his time in captivity, he learned a lot about how men are organized and what they do every day. Information that was now very important for his survival. Morrison moved precisely, as if he had done this many times before in dangerous places, to get to the spot where the ammunition boxes were stacked next to the main campfire. One of the torches fell right on top of the boxes. The explosion that followed was terrible. It sent pieces of rock and metal flying through the cathedral like deadly bullets. Hello. The explosion did more damage than Hayes thought it would. As more of the chamber's roof fell in, it created a shower of stones that made the cathedral an even more dangerous place to be. Several of the bonfires were put out by falling objects and dust, making it very hard to see and forcing everyone to move through the chaos without looking. Hayes used the fact that it was partly dark to go down to the cathedral level, as you fly through the rubble and avoid the shots that are still being fired. Rang through the room, and he walked toward the spot where he had last seen Elizabeth Fairmont. His heavy breathing mixed with the groans of the hurt and the screams of the criminals who were trying to get their defense back together. He crouched down behind a stack of boxes that had been thrown over by the explosion and found Elizabeth Fairmont there. She had a cut on her forehead that was bleeding a lot, but the fight in her eyes hadn't changed after being held captive for so long. When she saw Hayes coming, At first, she ran away because she didn't know he was there to save her. Hayes was able to quickly let them know that she was the sheriff of Marshfield and that a rescue team was trying to get her out. Elizabeth Fairmont started giving important details about the criminal group right away. She said there were at least 20 men in total and that many of them had already left for jobs along the train route. She also said that a man only known as was in charge of the group, Colonel, who kept in touch with criminals in Chicago on a regular basis. More importantly, Elizabeth Fairmont learned while she was being held captive that the group planned to use the information they got from her to carry out a series of thefts in the East, including at the Boston banks where her family had accounts. The train theft was just the start of a much bigger plan that would involve several states. While Hayes and Elizabeth Fairmont talked for a short time, Morrison was able to find a different way to get away. The explosion opened up a natural passageway that had been hidden behind one of the cathedral's walls. The passageway looked like it went up, and it might have been connected to tunnels that would take them back to the surface without having to go through the other criminals. But getting out of the cathedral wouldn't be the only hard part. Elizabeth Fairmont was clearly shocked and physically worn out, so it was unlikely that she would be able to make it through the hard work. Go up to the surface by going through the unstable tunnels. In addition, the criminals who had survived the attack would certainly try to pursue them and knew the mines much better than the ransom expedition. Hayes made a choice that saved Elizabeth Fairmont and stopped the attack that was supposed to happen on October 25th. Instead of trying to get away right away, he decided that the group should stay in the cathedral long enough to destroy the criminal operation completely. These are the maps, papers, and supplies. There were years' worth of plans that, if lost, would stop the organization in its tracks long enough for officials in other states to get the word out. Morrison and the other people on the expedition started destroying everything they found in the cathedral in a planned way. Maps were torn up, papers were burned, and supplies were strewn around or destroyed. Elizabeth Fairmont insisted on helping, even though her health was getting worse, and she knew exactly which materials were most important to. The criminal scheme. During this crazy time of destruction, Elizabeth Fairmont told Hayes something that really shocked him. Criminals tried to get her to tell them where a large amount of gold that Charles Fairmont had found and hidden in the Ozarks before he was caught was. The thieves didn't own the gold. It was part of a shipment they had stolen months before, and Charles was able to sneakily get it back. The shocking news about. With the hidden gold, Hayes had a whole new view of what had happened in the mines of the Ozarks. It wasn't just that Charles Fairmont was an interested detective who found the criminal operation by accident. He had been sent on a specific mission to find stolen gold that, even by today's standards, was worth a lot of money. Elizabeth Fairmont quickly told him that Charles had found proof that the criminal group had taken a shipment of gold that was going to banks in St. Louis earlier this summer. Even though the theft was done with military precision, Charles was able to track some of the gold to Ozarks mines that had been abandoned. His secret recovery of a large part of it was caught when it was found. Elizabeth Fairmont was the only one who knew where Charles had hidden the gold that had been found. She was able to keep this information a secret even while her prisoners were being questioned harshly. This information made his life better too, valuable for thieves to waste right away. But that was also what would kill him once they told him where the treasure was hidden. Even though the expedition was still destroying things in the cathedral, Hayes could hear sounds that meant more criminals were coming back to the mine. Voices from far away could be heard echoing through the tunnels, along with the sound of heavy boots and tools being moved quickly. The people from the group who had left to get ready for. The people who attacked the train were going back to look into the gunfire and explosions that could be heard in the mountains. Morrison found important information about how to get out of the situation in the documents that were being thrown away. There was a detailed map of the mines among the papers. It showed not only the known tunnels, but also natural passages that the criminal group had found while working there for years. There was a secret right there in one of these passages. Exit that is more than 2 miles from the mine's main entrance. In a remote part of the mountains, where thieves kept horses and emergency supplies, the secret exit opened up. Not only would the expedition have been able to get out of the mines faster if they had been able to find this exit, they would also have been able to use different means of transportation to get to Marshfield much more quickly. Before they could leave, Elizabeth Fairmont insisted that they get Charles had hidden some gold. She said that it would be hard to convince authorities in other states of how big the crime operation really was without gold as proof. The recovered gold also legally belonged to the banks from which it had been stolen, and giving it back would be a key part of breaking up the criminal network for good. Hayes had to make a very hard choice. To get the gold back, they would have to spend more time in the dangerous mines with armed thieves. Coming together to support you, but Elizabeth Fairmont was right that the evidence was very important. Without solid proof of the operation, The criminals who made it out would just regroup somewhere else and keep doing what they were doing. On the way to the secret exit, that's where the hidden gold was. Elizabeth Fairmont said that Charles had carefully picked a place that would be easy to find for people who knew the exact landmarks but impossible to find for people who didn't have correct information. It was gold, hidden in a small natural chamber that could only be reached by crawling through a narrow crack in the rock for several meters. Morrison led the group through the tunnels to the spot that Elizabeth Fairmont had pointed out. The trip was tense because they could always hear criminal activity in the passages behind them. It was clear that the thieves had found the destroyed cathedral and were planning a methodical search through the tunnels. Voices yelling orders and angry voices could be heard through the rock. The sound of getting weapons ready. When they finally got to the hiding place Charles Fairmont chose, it was very smart. Hayes wasn't sure at first if anyone could get through the fishermen in the rock because it was so narrow. However, Elizabeth Fairmont showed how her brother had found a way to crawl through the hole and into a small natural chamber on the other side. The gold that Charles had found was inside the secret chamber, along with other papers that he had brought with him. Gathered information about the crime operation. Each of the small leather bags holding the gold had a number on it that matched the records of the banks that had been robbed. The amount was big enough to be proof beyond a doubt that the crimes were committed. What was found with the gold was even more valuable than the gold itself. Charles had been able to get letters that showed links between the organization of the Ozarks and criminal groups in AT. There are at least 6 states. There was proof that public officials had been bribed, lists of informants in several cities, and plans for future operations that would cover the whole Midwest of the United States. But getting back the gold and documents took a lot of time. As the group worked to get the treasure through the small crack, the sounds of the criminals searching got closer and more urgent. It was clear that they had found clues about the group's path and were moving quickly toward them. Hi, Elizabeth. Even though her health was getting worse, Fairmont insisted on carrying some of the gold herself. In every move and choice he made, it was clear that he was determined to finish the mission that had cost Charles his life. The only thing that kept her alive in captivity was her desire to make sure that her brother's death was not in vain. Morrison looked at the stolen map and figured out that they would still need at least 2 hours to get to the secret exit. 2 hours of going through unstable tunnels while carrying heavy gold, along with a tired woman while being chased by thieves who knew the mines better than they did. Every minute that went by, the chances of success seemed to go down. When they tried to escape through the tunnels, it became a desperate race against time and the criminals who kept coming closer. Morrison led the group through passages that got narrower and less stable as they went down. The sound of boots on rocks below echoed through the depths like the beats of a scary drum, marking the rhythm of a death march. Guessed. Elizabeth Fairmont had a hard time keeping up, but she carried her share of the recovered gold with a determination that showed how tired she was. Each step she took was a fight against her body's weakness, which had been caused by being held captive and being mentally tortured for days. Deep down, though, she was driven. To honor Charles's memory and finish the mission that had cost so much, he had to keep his muscles from shaking when they were about to give out. Hayes saw that criminals were making quick progress. They knew. There were shortcuts through the mines that let people move faster, but the rescue team had to take longer, safer routes to stay away from collapse and poisonous gases. The voices of people being chased got louder, closer, and scarier with each turn in the tunnels. Morrison found something that would change his plan to escape while he had to take a break to move the gold around. The stolen map showed a number of different tunnels that the thieves had dug to make more than one way out. Routes. If they could get to one of these forks, they could split up into smaller groups that would go in different directions, which would make their pursuers lose track of them. The plan was risky because it would split up the expedition, making it harder for them to defend themselves if they were attacked directly by criminals. However, it would also increase the chances that at least some people would make it to the surface alive and bring important information about the criminal operation with them. The choice was made by Hayes to put the plan when they got to the next correct fork. Elizabeth Fairmont surprised everyone when she suggested a change to the plan that showed how well she understood the situation from a tactical point of view. She suggested that each group not only go in different directions, but also bring different pieces of evidence with them. The other group would still have enough information to reveal the criminal group even if the first group was caught. That plan came from desperation, but it was also based on the knowledge that it had very little chance of working. The knife. After another 40 minutes of moving through tunnels that felt like huge fists trying to crush them, they reached the end. Morrison and 2 other men would follow the easiest way to get to the secret exit with most of the gold. Hayes, Elizabeth Fairmont, and the other 2 men would take the most important papers through a different route that might be longer but safer. The moment of separation was tense in a quiet way. All of the men knew it might be the last time they saw each other, alive. Morrison gave Hayes a quick handshake, which was a simple act that meant a lot because they had known each other for years and trusted each other. Elizabeth Fairmont gave the most important papers to each group. As she did this, her hands started to shake a little because they were so painful and meant so much sacrifice. The group led by Hayes started their trip by taking the different path, going through tunnels that Morrison had marked on the map as possibly unstable. The sound of the people chasing them became jumbled and far away as. Because the 2 paths split, there were many echoes that made it hard to tell how many criminals were on each path. It was just the kind of mess Hayes wanted to make. During the walk, Elizabeth Fairmont shared more details about the group she had seen while she was being held captive. Colonel was not just a common criminal. He was also a Civil War veteran who had betrayed his country and put together a group of other disappointed veterans. They did things in a military-like way and coordinated their crimes, which showed how complex their schemes were. Even scarier, Elizabeth Fairmont found out that the group was connected with dishonest city officials in several cities. People like sheriffs, judges, and even federal agents were regularly paid to ignore evidence or give information about investigations. This meant that they couldn't always trust the local authorities, even after they got out of the mines. It looked like the other tunnel they were following was. It was this structural instability that led Morrison to make worried notes on the map. Small stones fell from the ceiling every once in a while, making a steady drumming sound that blocked out other sounds. Hayes started to worry that the weight of 4 people might be enough to make the building fall down even more. That's when they heard something that stopped them right away. It wasn't the sounds of a chase that helped him get away. The clear sound of gunfire could be heard echoing through the tunnels. The way Morrison and his group had gone. The heavy, continuous gunfire suggested that Morrison's group and the criminals who had caught up with them would be fighting for a long time. Hayes had to make a very hard choice. If they went back to help Morrison, they would almost certainly walk into an ambush, putting Elizabeth Fairmont and the evidence they were carrying in danger. But going on might have meant leaving Morrison and his men to die in the mines. Mary Elizabeth Fairmont. He got out of the problem by making a choice that shocked Hayes. She insisted that they keep going until they reach the secret exit. But Morrison knew the risks when he agreed to lead the group with the gold. He also chose the safer, more direct route because he knew it would be more dangerous. There was a sacrifice he was making to give Hayes's group a chance to get away with the most important evidence. Going back now would waste that sacrifice. After a few more minutes, the sound of gunfire stopped all of a sudden, leaving an ominous. The tunnels were dead quiet, like a sign of death. Hayes knew that Morrison and his men were probably dead, but he also knew that the only way to honor their death would be to finish the mission and reveal the criminal group. Now there are only 3 people left in the group, and they kept going through the shaky tunnel, not only carrying the weight of the stolen documents, but also the weight of being the only ones who can bring evidence to light. It had become Elizabeth Fairmont, more than a person who was saved. Now that she was alive, her testimony was very important. If she lived, the deaths of Charles Morrison and the others would have meaning. The unstable tunnel leading to the secret exit stretched out in front of them like the throat of a very old animal. The walls were damp with sweat and looked like they could fall at any time. Hayes, Elizabeth Fairmont, and the 2 men who were still on the expedition moved forward in complete silence. Each step was planned to avoid any vibrations that might have caused problems. Start the collapse that everyone thought was coming. Elizabeth Fairmont had found a strength inside her that couldn't be explained. Days of being locked up, being tortured mentally, and seeing violence had not broken her resolve. If anything, the thought of being free seemed to have given him new energy. It was as if the promise of justice for Charles was enough to keep his tired body going over the last few miles of dangerous rock. When they finally got to the secret exit, they saw that it was a magical portal. From the depths of the mountain, they came out. When they came out of the tunnels after being in the dark for so long, the evening light from the Ozarks was like a revelation from God. The crisp October mountain air filled their lungs with a sweetness that was very different from the heavy, death-filled air they had been breathing in the depths. The map showed exactly where the criminals kept their supply cache, which was close to the exit. Thor's horses were waiting in a makeshift corral with food and tools that would be used. Let people move quickly through the mountain trails. It was clear to Hayes that they were using the criminal group's own tools to get away. A bit of irony that Charles Fairmont would have liked. It became an impossible race against time on the way to Marshfield. The attack on the train was set to happen on October 25th, just 2 days after the attack. If they could get the railroad authorities' attention in time, they could not only stop the crime, but they could also catch the rest of the group when they tried to escape. Carry out the attack. Hayes was impressed by how determined Elizabeth Fairmont was as she rode. In spite of being physically weak, she kept up with him on the Ozarks' steep trails. She kept her eyes on the horizon, as if she could see into the future and tell when justice would be done. The papers they carried were more than just proof. They were proof that Charles and everyone else who had been hurt by the criminal group was right. They got to Marshfield just as the first stars started to appear, to show up in the sky in October. After everything they had seen and done in the mine, the small town looked different. After seeing the horrible things that happened underground, the lights in the houses gave off a warm glow that made them think of safety, family, and normalcy. Hayes sent telegrams right away to Springfield, St. Louis, and Chicago police, warning them about the planned robbery and giving them detailed information about how big the crime operation was. Mary Elizabeth Fairmont insisted on writing a letter to her family in Boston herself to let them know that she was still alive and that the truth about what had happened to Charles had been found. The attack on the train was stopped, but not the way Hayes had hoped. The criminals had to give up their planned attack when the railroad changed the route of the gold shipment. Even more important, over the next few months, Elizabeth Fairmont's network of dishonest officials and informants was slowly found out and destroyed. Morrison and his men were never found. The parts of the mines where the final fight happened collapsed completely, sealing off the tunnels that had been the site of many crimes for good. In Marshfield, some people said they could still hear strange sounds coming from deep in the mountain at night, as if the mine still held secrets that would never be told. After being saved, Elizabeth Fairmont stayed in Marshfield for 2 weeks to get stronger and help others. Police officers who came from different cities to look into the crime operation heard detailed testimony. When he finally left to go back to Boston, he took with him not only the evidence he had helped protect, but also a deep understanding of how fragile life is and how important justice is. A few years later, the Ozark Inn Hotel, where Elizabeth Fairmont had first stayed, was closed because the railroad changed its main route and Marshfield became smaller and less important. The owner, Thomas Whitaker, kept the room where she had stayed was left just the way it was, as a silent reminder of the events that turned his small town into the setting for a story that would be told for years to come. Even now, the Ozarks' abandoned mines are still closed. The authorities blocked the entrances because they knew that some stories are better left buried deep in the ground. However, on 4 nights when the wind blows through the Missouri mountains, people who live there say they can still hear strange whispers coming from the cracks in the rock, as if Charles and Elizabeth Fairmont are still trying to tell anyone who will listen their story. When the case of Elizabeth Fairmont came up, it was a sad reminder that macabre secrets could be hiding in small, rural towns in the 1800s, waiting for investigators who were brave enough to go down to where the truth was buried. Because one woman was so determined to find her missing brother, a criminal network that included people from several states was revealed. This shows that sometimes justice needs to be done by a jury. Sacrifices that reverberate through time like whispers in the earth. Thanks for watching. If you liked this trip through the Ozarks' dark secrets, please give our channel a like. Sign up to get more scary stories that bring to light long-lost mysteries in American history. If you have your own ideas about what happened in those abandoned mines, don't forget to share them.